Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panelists. Chief Executive Officer, Habitat for Humanity International, Jonathan Reckford. Senior Vice President, Skanska USA Building Incorporated, Chair, Board of Directors, U.S. Green Building Council, Elizabeth Heider. Chief Architect, Daw'an Mud Brick Architecture, Salma Samar Damluji. Undersecretary General and Executive Director, UN Habitat, Clos. And our moderator, columnist, The New York Times, Nicholas D. Kristof.
Thank you. Now, this panel is a little bit of a pioneer. In the past at CGI, women and girls were a separate track, and this time it's integrated with another topic, the built environment. And now we all know that women and girls are important, we all know that the built environment is important, but this is really an effort to integrate two important topics and see how they actually relate, to get a little bit ahead of the curve. And that happens in all kinds of ways. One of the people here is actually a doctor from the Bay Area, Laura Stachel, who went to West Africa to see if she could save lives using her obstetric skills. And then when she actually got there, she found that she couldn't, in some cases, operate, couldn't deliver babies because there was no light. And so now she is focusing not so much on bringing doctors, but on bringing solar power to maternity clinics there. And as one example, there are many, many more. One of the things we don't even think about in this country is title for a land, before you even build a building. And worldwide, only 1 to 2% of titled land is actually in the hands of women. Only 1 or 2%. Despite a great deal of evidence that if you give women assets, their children do much better. So, Joan, you're coming at this from UN Habitat. You were mayor of Barcelona. How do we actually go about giving women more title to lands in a way that will hugely help economic development?
Well, this is a very basic requirement. We need to advance in that field because the situation it's very limited, and we cannot allow and give proper leverage capacity, for example, to families and to women if they don't have titles. The question of access to titles for women, as you said, it's very clear. Only 1% of the titles in Earth it's owned by women. But there's another question also. Only about 18 to 20% of the land in Earth is titled. There are other ancestral ways of registering the property of the land, which doesn't end up in a legal instrument, and they cannot access to the modern finance systems that we are used to in the developed world. That presents a very complex issue. We need to address that. We need to introduce and enlarge the knowledge of in these societies to establish institutions which allow for proper land registration, and especially for women.
Well, and as you say, this is a particular challenge in the developing world. One might think that in countries without a sophisticated legal system, without a lot of land title, and where there are traditional attitudes towards women that maybe are unhelpful, this is insurmountable. But Jonathan, now in the aftermath of the tsunami, you worked on this precise issue. And tell me how you did it, and if so, did it succeed?
Thanks, Nick. We ended up building 10,000 houses on the southeast Indian coast following the tsunami, and we titled all of them in women's names.
And we, I should say, is Habitat for
Humanities. Thank you. And then worked with a coalition of local governments and the state government to start changing policy. And so we've seen over time is significant socioeconomic representation of tens of thousands of women, but that's also led to women now participating in village councils and having a role in those very tough decisions where they were relocating families off the coast into new territories. So it's a very successful advocacy effort from our perspective.
Now, one of the things that is striking about the built environment industry, if you will, from construction, architecture, design, is that this is a huge employer, but it's a huge employer of men. it's one that women are negligibly represented in. Although I think one of the people here is Edna Adan from Edna's maternity hospital in Somaliland, who, in building her hospital, created the first female brickmakers in Somaliland, basically because she had the money and she was paying for bricks and was able to use that leverage to bring women into the brickmaking trade. But Beth, you come at this from the private sector, but also from the nonprofit world. Do we just need to surrender? I mean, that that men are physically stronger, that there isn't going to be progress here, or are there things we can do to make this an employer of women as well as men?
I think that actually there's been a tremendous amount of progress made. I was asked to do an article in 2000, and the Washington Business Journal did some background information. 2% of the building industry, that's both design and construction at the time, were women. And so I did a little bit of statistical research. Skanska, the company that I work for now, has about 14% women in the field. We have about 80% women in the office, so there's a terrific opportunity there. One of the things that I've seen in my own career is the emergence, and of course I'm the chair of the U.S. Green Building Council, so I've been engaged in sustainable design and construction now for at least 12 years of my career. There's a much larger subset of women in that area. And my sense is that one of the reasons for that is that building sustainably, when you finally get your head around the triple bottom line of sustainability, is actually kind of a spiritual endeavor. It's a big deal. It allows you to be and look at the world through a lens that's much bigger than yourself. And so at the U.S. Green Building Council, about 65% of all employees are women, and nearly half of all the senior leaders are women within the U.S. GBC. So I've seen just over the arc of the last 10 years a tremendous uptake, and I think that sustainability in particular is a great catalyst for women's participation.
And Beth, I think that it's easy for us here in this country to say, well, we're so much ahead of other countries. If one looks at governance, however, which is another aspect of how we actually use that built environment, then there's pretty good evidence that female participation in governance makes a real difference. In corporate governance in this country, I think 17% of board seats belong to women. Is that something that we should be thinking about as well, and would it actually make a difference?
Yeah, I think it makes a huge difference. On USGBC's board, we're about 40% women. I've read, and I actually kind of believe this to be true, that if you have just one woman on a board, whether it's corporate or whether it's a NGO type of board, that you have a token. If you have two, you have a conspiracy. And if you have three, you can actually experience meaningful change. So I think that getting to that tipping point of having about 3 or a third of board leadership as women will make a significant difference.
I should say that the rules are different on a panel. That 2 is actually a significant change.
50%.
Now, Salma, you're on the front lines of this whole effort. I mean, we're kind of talking in theory. You are originally Iraqi. You're an architect. You're working in Yemen, which is a country with truly maybe the most beautiful architecture in the world. If you ever have a chance to go to Yemen, it is a stunning country. And one great thing about it these days is you don't have to fight off other tourists.
Which is an advantage.
Which is great. And now your focus is mud brick architecture. 3 billion people in the world live or work in mud brick buildings. 3 billion. What specifically, can you give us a sense of what the specific issues are that, if we're thinking about this from a gender point of view, what we can do that is actually going to make women in those buildings more empowered, more able to get an education or to participate economically in life around them?
I think this is a very important issue, and Yemen is an important point at stake here. Because just to go back one step, firstly, you'd be shocked to know that women in Yemen, women in Yemen actually participate in building. And there are regions that you haven't heard of. The one I work with is called Hadramaut. It's the biggest province or region in Yemen. And the other two regions...
And Hadramaut, I should say, is also the ancestral homeland of Osama bin Laden, although he has never set foot there.
Well, that's right. He never set foot there, but his family, like many other families who are wealthy businessmen, the brains behind Saudi Arabia, I should say, the biggest contractors there, so we also need them. And they've been a great help to us in rejuvenating this and rehabilitating the architecture, because they also are the owners and the builders of a huge urban culture. And what I wanted to say before you interrupted me was that women, because we don't have much time here, women in these areas, in Hadramaut, in Yafa, in Daw'an, actually help the men in building. They go out of the houses, they help in making mud brick, they help in carrying and cutting and rendering the stone, and most importantly, they have a huge role in doing the interiors of the houses. They're the ones responsible for the beautiful colors and designs and renderings that you see on the interiors of these magnificent buildings. The buildings we're talking about that are built out of mud brick and stone, or we call it earth architecture now, but it's shale, mud brick, and stone, are palaces. They're built out of 6 and 7 stories in height. They are load-bearing walls. So people really used to live, and some of them are still living like princes, and they're not, even though they may be poor financially, because President Clinton did rightly mention yesterday, if you remember, that Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the region. But for someone like me, an architect, and I think passion and commitment are very important here, it's also one of the richest. The urban culture is extremely rich there.
I'm really careful now about interrupting you. I'm walking on eggshells. But considering, that 3 billion people do live and work in these buildings, and now one issue that we know intellectually in these structures is that women often stay in them, that they're cooking in them, that indoor air pollution is the worst kind of air pollution. So many women around the world die because they're ingesting this smoke. Is there something we can do about there? Are there designs, or are there...
Yes, I think one of the most important topics about the session this year is design for impact. And I think for us architects, this is a very meaningful term that we work with all the time. And it's also a dilemma and a crisis. But one of the advantages of where I'm working in Yemen and in general, in the country in general, is that those buildings are extremely well designed. And we have a lot to learn from them, as opposed to the other way around.
What?
And, for example, the kitchens. In buildings that are 5 or 6 or 7 stories in height, kitchen areas are set up always with terraces and with open areas. And or in courtyards on ground level. So they're always extremely well ventilated. And the kitchens are in rooms. It's not one kitchen. So you have one for baking and one for cooking and one for preparing. So it's a very sophisticated way of operating. It's a complex design that we have a lot to learn, that we in the West, I'm talking about the West, have a lot to learn from. And I've spent the last 30 years just learning.
And help our audience out. Now, I'm sure some people are furrowing their brows, and they're thinking, well, yeah, I'm sure that title is useful, that designing in a more inclusive way for women would be a good thing to do, but that if you think about the global priorities, the global needs, about how many girls around the world, 76 million or so, aren't even going to primary school. How many kids are dying of diarrhea each year? 350,000 women dying in childbirth each year. Then you have all these huge priorities. Why should the built environment rise to that level? Why should it be a priority?
Well, urbanization, that's to say the built environment with basic urban services, it's now an heritage which affects 50% of the world population. At the beginning of the 19th century, the urban population of the world was 2%. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was 20%. And now it's 50%. And we assume that we are going to reach 65 to 70%, but we will move from 7 billion that we are now to 9 billion. That means that in the next 20, 25 years, the expected urban population will double. That means that 2.5 billion more people will live in urban areas in the next 30 years. And then as this growth is mainly taking place in the poorest part of the world, where the people has less rights, this is the important question on how this very speedy evolution is going to take place. Is there any chance that this urbanization is done with the basic level of quality and services that can provide an improvement to the people? Because if this is not the case, a lot of people will be worse off in the urban area than they were before in the rural area. This is the huge challenge of the next 20 years.
I think there's, in addition to even a more basic level, a lot of our solutions end up being siloed, and yet they're very much interconnected. And so if a girl doesn't have at least a basic shelter in which to live, she's not going to stay healthy, which means she won't have a chance to go to school, even if a school is available, and then she won't have the chance for livelihood. If there aren't inheritance rights, she's vulnerable. She's physically vulnerable if she doesn't have a door that locks. So there are a whole series in which shelter is part of the overall solution.
I think essentially, I'm going to be very brief, urban culture is not a luxury, it's a basic need. And I think the quicker we turn around to this, the better it is in order to understand what the real problems are. It's not about providing people, just providing people shelter and food and water, and a better quality of life can only be achieved if you have a proper urban culture. And the dignity Secretary of State was just talking about a bit earlier precisely is in that. I mean, she put her point on it.
And presumably safety is that if you want girls to be able to get to school, then you need to be able to think about how you manage urban communities. You need to think about transportation. I mean, I think one of the problems in Haiti post-earthquake was that there wasn't enough consideration about safety for women there.
Yes, of course. Safety, it's again another very basic human right. And if the society doesn't reach the level where there has some institutional capacity to guarantee safety, safety becomes a kind of personal responsibility. Everybody needs to care for their own safety in the absence of a proper state. And then, the reaction to that, it's very problematic. And we, when we take care about the urban design, we say, okay, yes, from the better urban design, we can provide some space which is safer. But if there's no responsibility, institutional responsibility at the state level, that's very difficult to guarantee. Then we, at the same time that we are improving our design for safety, especially for women, we need to encourage as Secretary of State Clinton has said before, we need to encourage the ruling elites of this country to take the due steps to guarantee this kind of basic services.
Because in Daw'an, where I'm working, in Hadramaut, we're working in Daw'an, a lot of the businessmen we're working with are the men who are investing money, and it's more like a private enterprise in the absence of institutions and governments that are working or putting any money into the infrastructure. It's these businessmen who are coming and doing this philanthropic work. And in the particular case of building schools for girls, because they didn't want to go to mixed schools with boys. So the chairman of our foundation, who does a lot of work in education, didn't want this, but he said, if this is what's going to take these girls to go to school, I'm building separate schools for them. And then they said, right, but we need private buses to go. We're not going to. So it's also about private initiative.
Presumably it's also about listening to women. I mean, I think so often these decisions are made by a group of really smart men who don't necessarily understand what local women are thinking of and don't necessarily get their buy-in. And so, I mean, it's really only fairly recently that people, I think, have appreciated the importance of building girls' toilets in schools if you want to get more girls in school in these countries, or focusing on water, which is, again, a women's issue in much of the world. We're actually, we have a little countdown clock that is looking reproachfully at me. So let me just go through and ask each of you to give one takeaway to the audience here of something very specific that needs to be done in terms of this juncture between women and girls and their needs and the built environment and the opportunities there.
Yes, perhaps for me, I would say that the challenge is so big, the numbers are so impressive, that I think the most important thing that we can think about is the huge task that we have in front of us. This is not a minor thing. This is going to be something that is going to shape the global agenda, including, by the way, security, in the next 20 years. The urbanization, especially of Africa, is going to be a topic on the most hot tables in the world for the next 10 years.
Salma?
I think I'll be very brief. I'd like you to think about the fact that the future is in mud brick architecture, in earth architecture. This is the future, not the past.
Next year, CGI will be in this huge mud brick building.
Why not? Yeah. You're all invited to Yemen to come and see in person.
Beth?
I think we need to look for those moments of genius. USGBC created the Center for Green Schools on the backs of the Green Schools Caucus, which was a nonpartisan way to get people interested in green building. It's grown into Green Apple, and you heard the commitment earlier this morning. But the beauty about engaging with schools is that women families want to send their children to places where they have a healthy environment, where they have good light so that they can excel in their studies. But it's more than that, because the lessons that the school provides, the children takes home to their parents. And so now all of a sudden you have an entire community being transformed. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to engage through the schools.
Jonathan?
It's for us really about access. What we've seen is if we can support programs that allow women to own and inherit property, participate in the local community development, and then have financial inclusion, access to savings and housing credit programs, they can really lift themselves up.
Well, I hope this taste of the intersection between gender issues and the built environment has whetted your appetite for more. And please join me in thanking this terrific panel today.